Hi, I'm Jeremy Lickness. I'm here with Dustin and Merrie. We're talking about the WinForms Designer coming out on .NET Core 3. You won't want to miss the stories they have about the challenges they faced bringing this into the modern platform. Welcome to another episode of On.NET. My name is Jeremy Lickness, and I'm here at the beautiful Microsoft campus. We've got awesome weather today. I'm here with Dustin and Merrie, and we're going to talk a little bit about WinForms. But before we get started, why don't we start with you? Tell me a little bit about what you do here at Microsoft.
Okay. I'm Merrie McGaw. I'm the dev lead for the WinForms team. So we're responsible for both the WinForms designer work that we're doing and for the actual runtime components for WinForms.
Okay. And Dustin?
I'm Dustin Campbell. I do a lot of things, but right now I'm focusing on trying to help this get this WinForms project kind of moving on to .NET Core 3, especially in the WinForms designer.
Very cool. So I've been with .NET for a very long time, and .NET Core was exciting news. One of the pieces of feedback we got when it first came out was, what about the desktop? What about WinForms? What about WPF? So now we're coming full circle. .NET Core 3 is coming out, and we've got support for WinForms. And one of the questions I get a lot is, what exactly does that mean? What is WinForms and .NET Core?
Well, it doesn't mean that we're going to be doing WinForms on Linux, for example.
Okay.
But it does mean that WinForms as a runtime is going to be up on GitHub. We actually went open in December. And we're taking community contributions to help, make the improvements that people have been asking for.
Right. But from a perspective of an application developer, it means that somebody building a WinForms application or taking an existing WinForms application and moving it forward into .NET Core 3 for the benefits of having performance improvements, being able to have a side-by-side experience where you can run it on many different .NET Cores. You can pick a different version of .NET Core. You can stick with one version of .NET Core and avoid some of the problems. We get a lot of feedback when the .NET Framework updates on Windows, and that it just affects everybody.
Sure.
Right? It happens in place, and so every application is affected by that. And so with .NET Core 3, because you can have multiple runtime living side by side, that allows a bit of freedom with a WinForms application. If it's a new development, great. You're on the latest and greatest, and it's a high-performing platform. We've done a lot of performance work in .NET Core. And if it's a legacy application, great, because that means you can put it in one place and leave it alone, and nothing will come along through Windows Update and break it.
So when you're talking about legacy applications, I can take an existing WinForms application, and is there a migration path to plug that into .NET Core?
Yeah. The migration path is a little bit DIY at the moment.
Okay.
But the way people typically do this is start a new project and copy all their code over. In a .NET Core world, you don't have to go and add files to that project. Everything's kind of added for you. And the project file is much slimmer. If you've checked out the .NET Core,
Sure.
you have a much slimmer format, so you're not dealing with a lot of the kind of arcane goo that shows up in the older project formats for .NET Framework. So you kind of get into a nice clean place, and your migration path. In most cases, I had an application. Right when we first had an internal build of this working, an application that was pretty substantial. It was a whole debugger for text adventure games.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Sorry,
I
forgot to say at the beginning.
games.
I'm a nerd. I forgot to say that. I'm a super nerd. But it was a whole debugging engine for that, and that I'd built on WinForms a number of years ago. And I was like, well, let's port it over and see how this works. And it was literally copying files in, and then there were a couple of cases where I had some references that were missing, and I could go out and find them. We had kind of up on NuGet, we had packages available that you could go grab to access, for example, like the registry, that sort of thing.
Sure.
And it worked fine. It was great. So the migration path isn't too hard if you're willing to put in just a little bit of work right now. There may be an opportunity for us to smooth out some of those edges, but that's kind of the story. It should in my experience, it generally kind of just works with most framework things. If you're off in the weeds a little bit, there are things in .NET Core that just aren't supported, that were from framework that aren't supported on .NET Core. Things like creating new app domains and some of these more arcane sorts of things that people definitely do. And there are other analogs for some of those old APIs. So some of it you have to kind of move forward, some old code, but in most part it worked. And my text adventure debugger works fine.
Nice.
Yeah.
We actually found that to be the case with a lot of the internal app building exercises that we've done. Is with a few minor tweaks, most apps migrated pretty easily.
Yeah.
So a huge part of WinForms and what we're focused on is the designer experience. And I remember specifically when WPF came out and there was an entirely different approach.
Right.
And a lot of people preferred some of it because they were comfortable with it, some of it just because it was so mature and the design made sense, how WinForms works for design. So you're working on taking something that's essentially been around for years and years and fitting it onto one of our most modern frameworks. What is that like? I can't even imagine where you start with that.
Yeah.
It's kind of tricky.
It is tricky.
Just a little bit.
And you touched on something there. It's also super important with WinForms in particular, is that the designer is really a key part of that experience. I love XAML. I love WPF. I love the XAML designer. But with the XAML language, it's easy to go and fairly easy. I mean, you can get a PhD in XAML, and you can go and you can write the XAML code yourself. And it's declarative. It's natural. It's not that difficult. That's not something I ever want to do with WinForms, right? If you've ever looked at the guts of the WinForms app, it creates that initialize component method with all of this code that we call code spit that's spit in there.
That's a very technical term.
Very technical term.
We've got a couple
called
of
code
those.
spit.
Yeah.
It really is kind of like the way that the WinForms applications are composed. When you create a WinForms application, you drop that button, you double click the event handler. That is so kind of ingrained in the designer experience, right? I don't know anybody that goes, I know a couple of people, but that don't want to say nobody, but that go and build a WinForms application by hand without a designer. It's really part of that experience. So it's absolutely critical, I guess, that we bring it forward.
It's the number one thing that we have to do.
Yeah, we can't get away without it.
And we have to do it pretty much the same behaviors that you're used to and the same performance that you're used to in WinForms Designer today.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean with respect to the code base and sort of behind the scenes to getting it done?
Okay. A couple of things. First, I've been spending, the WinForms code base has been fairly new to me. I'm not technically on the WinForms team. I've come in to help out and start kind of pitch in and try and get this effort up because I know it's really important for .NET Core 3's success, at least on the WinForms front, the designer's there. And the code itself, it's about 15, 16 years old. The WinForms designer, in the WinForms runtime, you could probably speak more to this. For a long time, it's been kind of a code base that we consider to be finished, completed, done.
Sacred might be a good word for it because you didn't want to change it. You could not afford to break existing applications with Windows updates, and you couldn't really do anything to degrade the performance and degrade the experience of what people already loved.
Right.
So this has been on ice for a while.
It's been on ice. It's been on ice. It's been serviced a lot, and the folks that make changes to it expect to be, making as small a change as possible. They're actually the team members are extremely good, passionately good at making these efficient scalpel-like changes.
Scalpels,
where they don't break anything else. They're just this one thing they're trying to fix. And so that's kind of the code base that we have today. It hasn't been updated in any way, just because it was written. The last time it was updated was in Visual Studio 2005.
Okay.
When we introduced partial classes into C# 2 at the time. We're coming up with C# 8, so that kind of dates it, right? And the idea there was that, prior to Visual Studio 2005, Whidbey was the code name of that. The WinForms designer would take that code spit and it would put it into the same file. Okay, so there would be a form one.cs, and it would had an initialized component method, and it hid it in a pound region inside your code, right?
Pound
and
region.
Then, yeah, in a pound region. Yeah. And then in Visual Studio 2005, then we had partial classes. We said, well, let's get this .designer file over here, separate over here, and then we started spinning over there. So I can see, I'm coming to this code base fresh, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, I see that refactoring. I see what they did to make the partial classes work. And then there are areas of the code base where it's pretty clear that everybody was learning C# 1.0 as it was being written, as C# was being developed. There's a lot of just kind of old anachronisms, things that you would never do today. There's a lot of old collection types that are long defunct that we wouldn't use today. Today you might use list of T. Well, array list is all over that, which was the old one from back in the .NET 1.0 days that we replaced in 2.0. So it's kind of filled with that sort of thing. So it's got a kind of archaic sort of bent to it that makes it a little bit difficult. But the real challenge of moving it over to operate on .NET Core 3 is that the WinForms designer works by actually creating the form itself. It creates the actual form object, the .NET object. It runs that initialized component method. It runs your user code in order to do that. And the challenge there is that now that form is not a .NET Framework form. Now it's a .NET Core 3 form.
Right.
But Visual Studio, in which the designer runs, is a .NET Framework application. Okay. And so we're kind of in a world where we're trying to create .NET Core 3 objects and make them kind of work in a .NET Framework world, yep. Right? And that's the key challenge there. And so the design we've gone with, it's also something that the XAML teams, designer teams working with, is the idea that it's a little bit crazy, but we have another process that's a .NET Core 3 process, and we create all the objects over there, create the actual form, and then we reparent the window handle from that process over there back into Visual Studio.
Okay.
And it's so we're doing this cross-process window reparenting, which is totally supported, but sounds crazy.
But it's actually, so you're spinning up a process of .NET Core wrapped in a layer of .NET Framework that's surfaced up through that window handle into the...
Actually, it's just pure .NET Core 3.
Just pure.
Yeah,
okay.
And so then we just talk about it in window handles. And then over on the Visual Studio side, we're communicating with that remote process. There's some interesting kind of old APIs in .NET that make that possible. So we can kind of create a model, a code DOM model of all of the code that's in your project, or your initialized component, all of that, and send it over to the other process and let it create all the code from there, or let it create the actual objects from there. But that's what we're doing, and it's a lot of fun. So we have a whole, something that the WinForms designer wasn't designed for. We have a whole remote kind of communication protocol that we're communicating with this other process. And some of the challenges are, for example, that the designer, WinForms designer, was written before, say, async.
Yep.
Any kind of thing like that. Any sort of modern sort of language constructs you would use for doing asynchronous programming, especially when you're trying to talk cross-process. You kind of want to, send a request over and then await right here for a response to come back. That sort of thing is very tricky and awkward, and so we're having to retrofit the WinForms designer with a whole bunch of that sort of thing. So it's fun.
Any unique challenges beyond the async and await, something that maybe surprised you as you started taking on the task of porting it over? Is it to a phase where it's mostly you've identified sort of the raw areas and it's muscle work?
I think the biggest surprise is how much we didn't know getting in there, and how much we still have to dig in and figure out what the rest of the challenges are going to be.
Yeah, I think that is probably the biggest surprise. Is I'm still surprised. I was surprised yesterday, in fact, as I'm trying to figure out a way to do something, and I'm debugging through the old code base, and I find, that's how it works. Oh, okay, well, let me shift gears and come up with a different, or slightly different modified design to what we were doing. And that's an ongoing kind of process. Right now we're in the stage of what we call the punch through. And the idea here is that if I were building a compiler, this would be the stage of the building a compiler that'd be trying to get to hello world, right?
Okay.
Just trying to get the compiler to make hello world happen, just get enough of that in there. And so we're kind of laying down the bones of the designer systems and figuring out what needs, whether our design is going to hang together all the way through, and what other work needs to happen. So that punch through, what's it look like? It's like
9-10 steps.
Yes.
It's your basic create a project, create a form, double click a button to put it on the form, and then double click to get your event handler.
Right.
Okay.
I think there's change of property.
Change of property in there too.
So
because the property grid needs to communicate.
Yeah, and there's a lot of pieces here. Like we need to learn how to figure out how to populate the toolbox from .NET Core 3. We need to make the property grid. Now the property grid is an interesting, it's a Windows Forms control. It's actually something you can put in your own Windows Forms application, the little property browser in Visual Studio. And that control itself, the way it works is it likes to operate right on your object.
Sure.
But that object's over here.
Right.
Another process,
In a totally different process, yeah.
So it likes to reflect over that object using another set of APIs that I'd forgotten about from days of yore. The whole set of APIs in .NET framework around type descriptors and property descriptors. And
yes.
Remember those? I forgot all that stuff. So, they're used by the property grid. And so we're figuring out ways that we can, in Visual Studio, since the property grid is in that process, we want to be able to have little proxies, not like .NET remoting. That's not supported in .NET Core. So not like .NET, and certainly not between .NET Core and .NET Framework, but creating our own proxy objects and know how to communicate, get back enough property data that we can sort of synthesize type descriptors and property descriptors for these proxy objects, and then we can trick property grid into thinking it's talking to the real object. At least it has the data it needs to present and edit. We prototyped that last December. That looks like it'll work. But these are some of the systems that you kind of have to go through and figure out, okay, that's how that works. Well, let's.
It's fascinating.
It's a lot of fun.
That's the first word that popped in my head was proxies when you started talking about.
But not the transparent proxy thing. If you remember that if you ever did the .NET remoting thing.
It's ages past.
Been a while.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
But you're having to dust off all those old skills and apply them. Were there any unexpected benefits or positive side effects from doing this change that you came across? Or is it more, let's just get to a state where we're parity with what the old design experience was, only on top of .NET Core 3 and its benefits?
That's the primary first goal, is to get as close to parity as we can get with the old designer experience, and not degrade things like performance and user interactions and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and one thing we kind of alluded to it, but didn't quite state it, was that we're leaving the old framework designer code base alone. We've completely forked everything. So now one of the benefits is that we're getting to clean up all this old code as we go. It's okay, we're going to break it, it's fine, because we're going to break it and make it work again. But we're leaving the old code base there and stay as sacred as it can be.
Right.
Yeah.
Keep supporting what's there.
Yeah. Keep that. Make sure that works great for .NET Framework 4.8. But yeah, for the .NET Core 3 world, now that WinForms is coming out in .NET Core 3, and it's more like revitalizing.
Absolutely, we're able to make changes in the runtime that we wouldn't have dreamt of making even a year ago.
Yeah.
In the desktop framework.
Right, and it's the same thing for the designer. And the thing is that now there's an opportunity, with .NET Core 3, then the next version of .NET Core, and the next version of .NET Core, that we'll continue to rev this the WinForms, and it will continue to grow and potentially evolve. And as we do that, we want to have a WinForms designer code base that also feels like it's modern and we can evolve with that. So that's kind of fun. That's been
that is fun. I mean, it's interesting because people say, "Hey, WinForms, it's old tech," but a lot of people say, "But this is what I write my desktop apps in because it works and it works well, and there's no reason to change it." And then there's a question of, well, what about support? Have you forgotten about it? So now it's revitalized. You're updating it. Have you had any surprises or feedback from the community that you weren't expecting, or?
I'd have to say the surprise for me from the community was exactly how enthusiastic they were. We have several new features, full-sized features that community members are proposing, and they're cleaning up old code, they're writing new tests. They've been extremely excited about the opportunity to get in there and kind of dust off their favorite old technology.
Yeah, and even though it's old, one of the things that's always been appealing about WinForms is that there's an ecosystem there that goes way beyond what we did, right? Like our button and list box controls are pretty basic, right?
Yep.
But if you take the third-party control vendors that are out there, the DevExpresses, the Infragistics, the Telerics, all of those guys, Grape City, they've created controls that'll let people build WinForms applications that look like the very latest Office or whatever.
Right.
And so, and that's helped WinForms to continue to have a long life, and there's a lot of affection for it because, well, maybe what's in the box isn't all that great, but the system is great, and they can take other components and make it look as modern as anything.
So they're
that's fantastic.
Probably dusting off their code bases and looking at the next phase for this too.
Yeah, we're actually working with them closely so that they know kind of the plans that we're making, the decisions that we're having to do in our code in the designer, because they're probably going to have to do something very similar in their design code.
Yeah, one of the there's a couple of little dirty things in the old kind of design of WinForms and the designer and how that worked that means some work for everybody who would build a control for .NET Framework, that now if they want to build a control for .NET Core 3 and have a great designer experience, they're probably going to have to do things differently. In the old, in the designer APIs that are there today, and these are part of .NET Framework, there's a system.design assembly in the framework that has all of this stuff in there, right? You can put a WinForms designer in your own app if you wanted to, you can do that. Well, that code is very much, it assumes that you're going to be running in the same app domain, same kind of, it passes around system.types everywhere, which are different between the .NET Core and .NET Framework. But it gets down into places where just the very control designer class, if you wanted to make a piece for Visual Studio for your control that had little smart tags and snap lines when you drug it around, you would descend from this control designer class. That control designer has a property on it called control, and that's literally a reference to the actual runtime control that's on the form, right? Well, that'll break usually, but what people do in their designers, they grab that control property, they cast it to their runtime control, and they call methods on it.
Right.
And all of that will need to change. There has to be a separation between now the piece that runs over here in the other process and the piece that runs in Visual Studio. And so, so it's a journey for everyone to move if they want to move on to .NET Core 3. But we're working with them to do that. And a bunch of them, I was talking with one gentleman at the MVP Summit last week, and he was just excited to go clean up the designer code base for their stuff. Their design time controls were they'd seen better days, so he was excited to just go clean it all up anyway. So he was looking at it as an opportunity to make it better.
I think a lot of people have looked at the moving to Core as moving their desktop apps to Core as a chance to get in there and clean up some old code.
Well, it's an opportunity to modernize the code base, do some refactoring, plug into the modern ecosystem, take advantage of the perf differences, and now open source, people can actually contribute to the core runtime. And I'm sure someone out there is contemplating, okay, how do I create an experience that renders on a platform besides Windows as well?
Right.
Yep.
So.
That's not something that we're officially getting behind at this point, but it's open source. It's GitHub.
Yeah, sky's the limit. So now the challenge is just going out and building the rest of it and cleaning up that code base, huh?
Yeah, it's kind of the, making our way through it. Get through this punch through and then start knocking down, issues and making it work.
Exactly.
So once we get the kind of the bones laid out, then it's going through every single control that we have in the framework and making sure that that separation works, right? We use those same classes. That control designer, there's an image list over here, there's an image list designer over here, and those need to be taught how to talk cross-process. So yeah, we're kind of forging ahead. It's quite a journey.
It is.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day.
Yeah,
You've got a
of
lot
course.
on your plate. It was really exciting to talk about this, and it's
thanks, Jeremy.
pretty neat that something, I won't use old, I'll use mature. Something as mature
Beloved. I like
and
beloved.
beloved as WinForms is seeing this revitalization, and you're ground zero part of it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks for coming.